get started. Our first panel this morning is covering fake news. Their focus is similarities and differences between fake news and plain old news. The conversation will focus on how to identify trustworthy information in general, and specifically the importance empirical truths and shared facts have on sustaining a healthy democracy. Our moderator this morning is Mr. Travis Basso, our librarian and college archivist. Welcome, Mr. Basso.
Thank you. Thank you. Fake news. I know it's a term we've all heard, but perhaps a term we fail to understand completely. So today's panel is going to unpack fake news, disinformation. We're going to be looking at news analysis, trying to understand news organizations, and just how we discern facts from opinions, perhaps. I'm joined by two panelists today. Our first panelist here, Damaso Reyes, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Damaso began his career as a storyteller over 15 years ago while still a teenager. As a young man of color growing up in one of the worst neighborhoods in America, he was fascinated by the way in which his community was portrayed in the media. As an adult, he chose to pursue photojournalism in order to ensure that there was more diversity in the images that are presented to the public. He has worked for institutions, and his work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, United Nations Development Program, Associated Press, Wall Street Journal, and many others. A 2008 Fulbright Scholar, Damaso is also the recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the Arthur F. Burns Fellowship. Damaso is a project leader at the World Policy Institute and the principal photographer of The Europeans, a photographic documentary project which is exploring the changes in Europe and its people are experiencing as the European Union expands and integrates. Damaso is also a living kidney donor and the head of global partnerships at the News Literacy Program, the News Literacy Project. The News Literacy Project empowers educators to teach students the skills they need to become smart, active consumers of news and other information, and engaged, informed participants in civic life. Welcome, Damaso. And our second panelist with us today is our student here, Madison Mariska. Madison is a senior here at Concordia College. Her major, interdisciplinary studies with a focus between English, history, and new media. After graduating, she hopes to continue and pursue a Master's of Library Science here with a focus on helping communities to have easy access to media in all forms. Thank you, Madison. So I'll turn it over to Damaso to help us unpack.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm very grateful that you guys got out of bed early. I remember as a college student, I purposely never picked a class before 10 or 11 a.m. because I enjoyed my sleep. So I appreciate the extra effort that you guys have taken to come out here. I'm guessing everybody here in the room has heard the term fake news? Yes? All right. So I work for the News Literacy Project. I'm also a journalist, as you heard. And this is one of these terms that I really want to stop using. And I want everyone in this room to stop using this term and to retire it. Mostly because it's inaccurate, right? It's an oxymoron. If it's news, by definition, it shouldn't be fake. But more importantly, the term has gotten incredibly politicized. And it's become a shorthand, I think certainly for some people, it's become a shorthand for news and information that I just don't like. And that's really, really damaging because sometimes there's important information and important news that challenges the way we see the world or challenges our strongly held beliefs or preconceptions. And oftentimes that's the most important news to hear or the most important information to try to process because we don't want to be making decisions based on erroneous information that can oftentimes lead to very dangerous actions and decisions. So I'd like to start the conversation by making an earnest appeal to retire the term fake news. fake news, when it was sort of first coined, was specifically talking about a form of misinformation which mimicked the appearance of legitimate standards-based news and information, right? So it was propaganda, usually, or misinformation, which was masquerading as the New York Times, the Daily News, the Beacon Journal, whatever sort of legitimate or standards-based news organization, in an attempt to trick you, to deceive you, to fool you. But oftentimes these days when we talk about fake news, we're really talking about misinformation in general. Misinformation is a very broad category. Satire can fall under misinformation. Different forms of native advertising or sponsored content can fall under misinformation. So it's a really broad term and a really broad topic, and it's worth us exploring and unpacking and learning what the different types of misinformation and, of course, disinformation, which is really targeted and malicious misinformation, exists. So I'm going to kind of leave it there because we're going to probably get into a lot of this stuff as we continue our conversation. But what I would encourage you guys to do is when you hear this term fake news bandied about or used almost sometimes as a slur or an accusation, really try to begin to question who's using this term, why are they using this term, are they using this term accurately? Which is something you should probably do for any statement somebody makes, but especially with such a loaded term as fake news.
Excellent, thank you. Madison?
Okay. I guess one point of discussion I had with regards to this was with the rising prevalence of what is seen as fake news, what would you say to those that are feeling apathetic or fatigued towards the media at large?
That's a question for me.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information out there. And it's often, I think, framed as sort of a negative thing. Being a Gen Xer, I see it as really positive. When I was a little bit younger than you guys, because by the time I was in college, the internet had sort of really come into full being. But when I was a high school student, I had very limited access to information. I had a couple TV channels, I had the radio, I had whatever local newspapers I could find. If I wanted to read The Guardian, which is a London-based newspaper, I had to get on the subway, take a bus, go to the library, and get a week-old copy of the newspaper. Now, I pull out my smartphone, I can read news and information from all over the world, and I can also connect to people from all over the world. So from my perspective, having access to all this information is a really good thing. That having been said, it can also feel really overwhelming. And I think the overwhelming part is because a lot of people and a lot of young people don't have the tools they need to filter and process that information. For me, I'm a journalist. I've been doing this for more than 20 years. I can process information. I can filter out the misinformation, the disinformation, the advertising really easy, so it doesn't feel overwhelming to me. But I can certainly understand how if you have a hard time differentiating between news and opinion and advertising, if you see information as sort of a flat plane where everyone's claims have the same amount of legitimacy, yeah, it's going to feel overwhelming. So, my argument is that we need to build up those muscles to help us filter that information so that we can accurately assess what's true and what's not, what's verified, what's not, and then interpret and process that information so we can make decisions and choices that are informed.
Excellent.
I guess.
And feel free to challenge me
No.
if you disagree.
No,
like.
no, I do agree. I think that's some very fair points with all of that. But it's just sometimes hard to not feel almost resentful towards it sometimes. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I think a lot of that is because people often feel disempowered. And a lot of the work that I do, both as a journalist and working with the News Literacy Project, is really about empowering teachers, but more specifically empowering students and empowering young people so that they don't feel helpless, right? Like, I totally understand this idea that how am I supposed to know what's true, what's not? How am I supposed to know that this person's opinion is fact-based and is a considered argument versus this person's opinion is more of a diatribe or polemic? If you haven't been taught that, if you haven't been given those critical thinking and assessment skills, it feels like you're lost at sea. And unfortunately, I think that's what a lot of the people who spread disinformation, they're counting on that, right? They want to muddy the waters. They want to confuse you so that they want you to get to the point where nothing feels real, nothing is true except whatever you believe. And that's a very, very dangerous place for a democracy to be at, because people will try to take advantage. They'll say, listen, don't listen to those people with their facts, their so-called facts. Listen to me, because I'm telling you what you want to hear. Now, one of the sad things about being an adult is that you don't live in a world where things are just the way you want them to be. You can't function in society just based on what I want to be true. You know, this morning, I wanted to sleep in until 11, but I had to get on a train at 8:33 in order to be here on time. Actually, 8:06. That was reality, right? If I slept till 11, I wouldn't be here talking to you. Like, I can't move that reality. I could choose not to be here. That would be a choice that I would make, but then, I would be very sad because I wouldn't get to talk to you guys. So, being able to deal with reality, being able to understand what's actually happening is important, because if you don't like what's happening, then you're able to change it. Or at least you'll be able to try to change it. But if you're under a misapprehension of what's happening in your town, your city, your college, a lot of the people who want things to remain the way they are, they don't want you to know what's happening. So they want you to live in this sort of perpetual fog of, well, yeah, they're going to say that this is bad, but trust me, this is good, especially if that good happens to benefit you in some way tangentially, but maybe it hurts somebody else. No, don't worry about it. It's fine. Okay, well, it's very comfortable for me to believe what makes me feel comfortable, but, part of the reason you guys are here, and not just here in this space, but here at this college, is to learn an inquiry-based life, to learn how to challenge your assumptions, to seek out and process information, and hopefully, make changes in your own lives and your communities based on that information. But if you can't tell what information is accurate or fact-based and not, it really becomes hard to be empowered and engaged as a citizen.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I like that. It's just, you have to engage to a certain point, but not, allow yourself to disengage completely. Still be, a part of the world,
People who run the world, they're engaged.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
You don't have to be engaged, but the people who are engaged are the people, they're the people who are showing up to vote. They're the people who are setting the policy. They're the people who are sitting in the city council hearings when the regulations are being decided. And, to quote Hamilton, you want to be in the room where it happens.
Yeah.
But if you don't even know that the meeting is happening, then you can't be in the meeting, right? And then you're like, well, why'd they pass that stupid law? Well, you weren't there to help them understand your perspective on it.
I always tell people that complain, and then I say, well, did you vote? And they say no. And I say, well, then you don't really have a space to complain. You need to engage.
Yeah, and voting is a really important part, but there are lots of other equally important parts of civic engagement. And one of them is just being informed, just knowing what's happening in your community is sort of the place where engagement starts. It's hard to be engaged if you don't know what to be engaged about, or even what you care about.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Do you think, could you let us know a little bit, why did the founding fathers, not that you know what they thought, but why did they build in freedom?
Me and George Washington,
right? Why did they
bros.
build in this sort of freedom of the press into the Constitution?
All right, so I love asking this question. I ask this question of teachers, and almost none of them get it right. So if you don't know the answer, don't feel strange. The First Amendment, right, the very First Amendment to the Constitution protects 5 separate freedoms. Without Googling it, who here can name the 5 freedoms that are protected by all 5, not just 1 or 2, all 5? Hit me.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, and freedom of the press.
Well, you said 4. Assembly. Yeah, that's the third one. That's the 5th one. Yes.
Very good, very
Only
good.
3% of Americans can answer that question. So when America was founded, when we were going through our revolutionary process, a big part of the beef, as one would say, where I come from, was that the British government had all sorts of rules and regulations that just applied to America. You can't do this. We're going to tax that. And it's interesting, if you look at the 5 freedoms that are protected by the First Amendment, a lot of them have to do with complaining, right? The right of petition, the right of redress to the government, basically the right to complain to the government that I don't like what you're doing. That was suppressed in colonial times. I don't want you to complain. I just want you to do what I tell you to do. It's like when I was a kid, like, don't ask me why, just do what I say. And so the press was seen as an important mechanism and an important avenue for dissent, right? The government has an unpopular position. We want to be able to, like, I don't like that position. I want to be able to tell other people why that position is wrong. I want to print a leaflet. The Founding Fathers understood that dissent could very easily be crushed if you don't have protections for the press. And over the past 100 years, the Supreme Court and other courts have expanded the idea of what the press is and speech is, so it's not just about journalists, but it's about every citizen's right to express themselves. In the early 21st century, especially with social media and the internet, we're now coming up against this, what are the negative things about free speech? Obviously, if I have the right to express myself, you may not like the way I express myself. Over the past 100 years, there's been a consensus that even speech we don't like should be protected, but that speech has an impact. And so there is a very vigorous debate about whether or not limits should be imposed on free speech or hate speech or speech that we find distasteful. And, to be clear, other countries around the world, including other liberal democracies, take different approaches. Governments from Canada to Europe punish what they would consider hate speech. You can go to jail for certain kinds of hate speech in certain places in the world. America is an outlier. We are probably the place where, as a citizen, you have the most right to say things that other people would find offensive. And America has always been trying to figure out where that line and where that balance is. There are kinds of speech in America that are not protected. If I threaten your life, that's not protected. That's not a form of free speech, as the courts have decided. If I create a dangerous situation or prompt somebody to commit a crime, that's not necessarily protected speech. So we've always had limits on speech. Those limits have moved, but one thing that I would ask you guys to consider as you are thinking about where the limits of free speech should be, and to be clear, when we're talking about, or at least when I'm talking about free speech, I'm talking about the ability of government to censor or limit speech. Companies like Facebook, Twitter, they're private organizations. They're the equivalent of me owning a bar and saying, listen, I don't want you to use these terms in my bar because I find them offensive. That's always been a protected right. But in terms of the government being able to say, if you say this, I'm going to throw you in jail, who gets to decide what's offensive? And can that shift? And can that be abused by a government who doesn't want to hear dissent. There are some people who might, and some of those people might be in this room. I'm not going to make any assumptions. There are some people who would find the term Black Lives Matter offensive. If you have a government or people in the government who feel that way, could they then use a hate speech or a speech limiting law to prevent people from wearing a T-shirt or stating that? I tend to be as I think many people in my generation and many journalists are, I'm always trying to figure out how government and other entities could abuse or limit laws that restrict expression, simply because we've seen it. I mean, we've seen it here in America. Early in our history, we had the Alien and Sedition Act, which one of our early presidents passed specifically to stifle dissent. He didn't like what was being said about him. I'm going to say that when you say this about the government, it's sedition, it's treasonous. That eventually got overturned, but it was a tool that the government used to quell dissent. And we see it around the world. We've seen it in our own history. So while nobody likes to be offended and nobody likes hate speech directed towards them, we also have to look at how that can be subverted and abused in ways that we don't expect. That's always something that we have to consider as citizens when we're considering limiting rights and freedom of expression. It's not an easy answer.
No, it's a very slippery slope, as I think you're kind of saying. It's just because you're upset by what one person says, it doesn't mean it should be illegal, to a point. Because then what you were saying will then in turn someone can be upset by it, and
it's possible. And again, other countries have taken different approaches. Germany, Spain, they have insult laws, they have hate speech laws. They're still functioning democracies with dissent. So it's not that it's impossible to do it, but obviously these sorts of laws can be abused. I'll give you a really quick example. I was doing some research in Eastern Germany, and I was specifically talking to a group that fights against racism and fights to protect immigrants. And they released a report talking about institutional racism. And the East German state or province that this organization exists in, it's a more conservative part of Germany. And so the local government began to investigate them as a potential hate group because they were using this term institutional racism. That obviously didn't make any sense to them. But it sort of shows how without good checks and balances, these sorts of laws certainly can be abused.
Looked like we had a question already.
More of an observation. Offensive speech, hate speech, it's repulsive, but it's not actually fake news.
No.
So where are you heading with this? How does this connect up with fake news?
So where I'm heading with it is that there have been calls for regulating fake news, regulating misinformation. How we do it, what the legal mechanisms would be for that, how that is compatible or incompatible with the First Amendment, I think becomes the question. Obviously, misinformation is a huge problem. Fake news, to use a term I don't like, is a growing problem on social media. What's the best approach? Is it a regulatory approach, which is what some people want? What role do the technology companies play? Spoiler alert, they play a large role. But what role does the public at large, consumers of information, have to play as well? I think these are parts of the questions that we need to unpack.
Yeah, that's a good point with about the social media companies, because there's just been so much within just this last week, because just yesterday, after Facebook's rollout of new policies regarding political leaders during the upcoming 2020 election, Mark Zuckerberg was testifying in front of the House Financial Services Committee. And in his testimony, when he was questioned as to whether or not Facebook would be taking down lies or fake news, Zuckerberg was quoted as saying, "In most cases, in a democracy, I believe that people should be able to see for themselves what politicians they may or may not vote for are saying and judge their character for themselves." So what he was basically saying was we're not going to be taking down things. And I think what they ended up saying was that they're going to do fact checks, but they're not going to stop the general public from seeing what we would coin fake news. So, like, what do we do about that? I don't know.
You know, it's really interesting if you look at the social media companies. Facebook and Twitter, I think, have staked out positions where they're saying, listen, we don't want to be the arbiter of what's true and what's not, because that gets into value judgments, and we don't want to be making value judgments. I think it's a debatable point. The truth is that Twitter and Facebook restrict all kinds of content and speech already. For reasons that are not completely clear or transparent. Facebook has a ban on nudity. Why? They've never explained like why that's something that should be off limits versus, well, you know, if a politician tells a lie, we shouldn't. It's a private company. I think they're groping in the dark and trying to figure out what their policy should be, and trying to figure out, well, how could this policy be abused? What kinds of speech would this limit? You know, it's not easy. That having been said, they've taken a very hands-off approach for a very long time, and for a long time they abdicated their role in spreading misinformation at all. They essentially denied it for a long time, and then when it became undeniable, they said, okay, we're going to start working on it. So obviously there's a role that the technology companies have to play, but, and I'm not diminishing that role because I think it's an important role, but the truth is that we live in an age of information where we cannot count on being protected by a government, by a media company, by a technology company from disinformation. The role of the consumer, and I put that in quotation marks, has shifted from when I was a high school student. We are no longer just consumers of information. We are also producers of information. Every time I tweet, every time I share something on Instagram or TikTok, which I don't have, or Snapchat, which I also don't have, I'm a producer of content. I'm a producer of information. Every time I retweet something, I'm sharing information. So I'm taking on a role that used to be exclusively dominated by large corporations with, you know, all sorts of mechanisms to check information. So I need to now take on additional responsibilities because I can't be sure as a consumer of information that the information that I'm seeing is verified, true, accurate, that it doesn't have a malicious intent. That's a very, very different relationship to information than the one that I grew up with. And I think that educators and adults and governments are having a hard time because that shift happened so fast. It happened in about 15 years. You know, that's a really fast, it's really short amount of time for such a fundamental change. And we're trying to figure out how to protect ourselves, how to educate ourselves, how to equip ourselves with the tools we need to be able to understand and interpret and vet and verify information. That used to be the role of researchers, scientists, journalists. Now everyone needs to be able to do that in order to function in an information age. It's not always easy.
Yeah. Looks like we have another question, and I encourage anyone else has a question, you can find a mic or write it down and get an index card to us. Yes?
I wonder if you could explain, you've used the word journalism a couple of times. Can you explain to us all the difference between, say, punditry and journalism? Okay, so I love talking about social media, but it's one of my favorite subjects, because bringing it back to news. Could you do that? Explain us the difference between a journalist and a pundit.
Sure. So as a journalist, the goal of a journalist, the role of journalism, is at its heart to inform you, to tell you what's happening, and usually to provide some context to help you understand why what's happening is important or the history behind what's important. Punditry is a form of opinion. So if I'm telling you, I might tell you what I think, right? I feel this way about this. So what you see a lot on cable news is you'll see like 4 people around a desk or 6 people in boxes, kind of Brady Bunch style on the TV. That's not news. That's people telling you what they think. They might ask a reporter, so what do you think the president is thinking? Unless that reporter, has ESP, that reporter can't tell you what the president is thinking. They can tell you what they think the president is thinking, and that opinion may or may not be informed. But again, it is an opinion. It's a distillation of, in an ideal world, it's an opinion that's based on facts, but it's still an interpretation and analysis. So punditry tends to be less rigorous. Listen, I think that, based on what I'm seeing outside, it's not going to rain for the next week. Mm-hmm. How do I know that? Have I looked at the radar? Have I looked at the barometer? That's my opinion. That's my guess. Journalism shouldn't be about necessarily guessing or giving you my opinion. It should be telling you, this is what happened yesterday. Here's the context for which it happened. Maybe, if we're looking at analysis-based journalism, here are the implications for what's happening. But that's sort of in theory, the bright line. And obviously, journalists don't always meet those rigorous standards, and they should be held accountable and explain when they don't. But there's a lot of opinion and a lot of punditry, which is masquerading as journalism, which I think is incredibly problematic.
We had a lot of student-submitted questions beforehand, and one theme that kept coming up among your questions was predominantly, how do we stop fake news or misinformation reporting? So I think it's really important to parse terms. Fake news is not reporting, not certainly as the way we would describe it. So I think the real question we have is, how do we stop the dissemination of fake news? As I mentioned, technology companies have a role to play. If their platforms are being used by organizations, governments, companies to spread disinformation, there are ways that technology companies can detect that and to stop that. But the truth is that fake news stops with you. Most misinformation, most disinformation is spread by people who aren't aware that they're spreading misinformation. So the best way and the most effective way to stop something going viral that's wrong or that's ill-informed is to ask yourself, do I know that this is true? If you can't answer definitively yes and answer a bunch of follow-up questions, which is, how do you know that this is true? What are you basing that certitude and that knowledge on? If you can't honestly answer that question, don't share the piece of misinformation, or don't share the piece of information, which may turn out to be true. Dig a little bit deeper. Try to find out whether or not it's true. If you can't figure out whether or not it's true in like 30 seconds or a minute, don't share it. You can investigate further and dig down and take his class on information literacy and learn some of the techniques for verification. It's actually not that hard if you have the tools. But the best way to stop fake news from spreading is to not spread it. And the problem, obviously, is we oftentimes, most of the time, when we're spreading misinformation, we don't actually know that we're spreading it. We're spreading it because oftentimes it confirms something we already believe. That's called confirmation bias, right? It's the tendency that we all have, even highly educated or especially highly educated people, to believe information which confirms what we already believe, the way we already see the world. And the converse is also true. I'm more likely to reject information which challenges the way I see the world. And people who create fake news and spread misinformation are honing in on that tendency. If you're a vegan and I want to spread some misinformation, I'm going to make a piece of fake news that says people who eat meat are less intelligent than vegans. What's that based on? Who cares? I'm smart, I'm a vegan, that must be true. People do this on both sides of the spectrum. They do it for things from all ranges of political beliefs, the left and the right. But they hone in on this confirmation bias that we all have. And if you're sort of not aware that you have it, then people are just they're gonna pull your string. They're gonna say, what is the thing that this person cares the most about? I'm gonna use Facebook's and Twitter's targeted advertising
to find vegans who live in Brooklyn who support Bernie Sanders. And I'm going to create a piece of misinformation which manipulates them in whatever specific way I want to.
Interesting. Yeah?
No, I was just gonna say, like, you have to just become comfortable with being uncomfortable, as you were saying before, you know?
Yes. Perpetual skepticism.
But
Yes?
not cynicism.
Yes, right.
Right? So skeptics, we question things. How do you know that? How do we know that's true? Cynics don't believe anything except what they want to believe. I'm a vegan, so I'm going to believe that all meat is bad under all circumstances. I don't care what information you present me. A cynic is someone who's almost impervious to new information. A skeptic is going to question things and be able to sort of absorb. Even as we question, right? I'm not freely believing everything, and I'm not rejecting everything. I'm asking a lot of questions, and I'm able to, if you convince me, if you give me information which I can process and I can verify, then I'm willing to change my beliefs. A cynic is sort of unable to to change how they see the world.
Interesting.
So it's important to note that distinction. We want you all to be skeptical. We don't want you to be cynical.
Excellent. Did we have a student question over here? Yeah?
I have a question about misleading information because when talking about fake news, there is also one more thing you have to think about is misleading information. When there is a very political issue or very important issue going around, we will have some other distracting information pulled onto us, like about some celebrities or some sports activity. We won't necessarily see it, but we will get pulled with information. What would you say or answer for such kind of news pulled into us or crushed into us, even if we don't really know that we are pulled with such information? So what would you answer?
So I wouldn't necessarily call that misleading information. You might want to call it distracting information. Anybody here watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians? Raise your hands if I've seen like one episode. I bring that up to say that you know the challenge with social media. How many people here have an Instagram account? Snapchat, raise your hands. Facebook, Twitter. Okay, so the thing that all of those social media have in common is that there are only two types of information you see on your Twitter stream, your Facebook stream, your Snapchat feed. You see the information or the pictures or the videos of people you follow, and you see advertising. So me, personally, I don't see that much misleading, to use your phrase, or distracting information because I don't get most of my information from those channels. I do get some, especially Twitter, because I follow a lot of journalists, but I actually go out and seek news and information. I go to the New York Times, I go to the Washington Post, I go to NPR, I go to the BBC. I go out and seek information. The problem with social media is that it's largely a passive way of getting information, right? I'm seeing what's on my feed. And if someone is targeting me with distracting information, then that's what I'm going to see. I'm not going to see the important information that I necessarily need to be civically engaged. So one of the things that I would say is think about who you follow in your feed. Do you follow news organizations? Do you follow journalists? Do you follow people who put out reliable information, or are you following your friends and celebrities? More than that, even if you follow lots of great journalists, are you being an active consumer of information? Are you going to news sites, places whose specific mission is to inform you? If I go to TMZ, their mission is to inform me about Kim Kardashian and Lil Wayne and celebrities, right? If I go to the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, their goal is to inform me, and I'm going to get probably a higher quality of information, and also probably less of that distracting information. So I think if we want to have less distracting information, we have to certainly curate our social media feeds, but then we have to go out and find that information. I can't stress to you enough, you, everyone in this room has access to more high-quality information than anyone in the history of human civilization. Ever. All 50,000 years or however long we consider human civilization. You guys have access to more accurate, fact-based information than I did as a 15-year-old. So I understand it's difficult, I understand you're being targeted, but the truth is, it's not that there isn't good information out there. It's that we have to seek it out, and we have to make sure that we know what it looks like so we can recognize the difference between quality information, fact-based information, and opinion, advertising, entertainment, propaganda, which are all forms of information as well.
Excellent. So we have a question up in the back there. I see a couple of hands around. That's great.
Hello. I am not hearing very much from the panel on the responsibility of media outlets to actually counteract a lot of this. If we're not going to call it fake news, perhaps we call it biased news. It seems to me that many media outlets nowadays seem to align with opinion that might be based in business, in other words, in making money. So I'd like to hear thoughts on, the responsibility, ethical, moral, however you want to see it, of large media outlets that actually, or for actually fact-checking or making sure that they're not going down a stream of implicit bias.
Do you have any examples that come to mind?
I mean, let's talk about TV channels. Let's go extremes and talk about Fox News versus CNN, for example.
Okay. I think that's a great question. It's something that comes up all the time, especially among my friends. And so I think that it's really important to, again, define terms. First, I would say that while there's a lot of quality reporting and good journalism that's happening in TV news, in general, I think it's a less, it's not as good a source as some other sources of information. Part of the challenge, or part of what we've seen in cable news specifically, to use the examples that you cited, is there's a lot more opinion. If you just look at 24 hours of cable news on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, to use the three big examples in the United States, from when those news organizations or those news channels were founded to today, the percentage of opinion-based TV that you see has grown, partially because it's cheaper to operate, right? I can get a couple people on a panel and pay them a couple $100 each versus sending a reporter out to somewhere, paying for the cameraman, paying for the editor. That's expensive and time consuming. And it often doesn't get as good ratings. So part of what we need to do as consumers is understand, when I see a bunch of people sitting around a table asking, what do you think about? That's not news. That's opinion. So looking at the actual news reporting, right? The actual news reports, not the opinion part, not the part where Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow sit around a desk and tell you what they think about the world, but the actual correspondents in the field. Largely, that stuff is still free of opinion and bias. Largely. Journalists don't always meet that standards, and producers don't always meet that standards, but that's their goal, and largely they do it. The problem, I think, with cable news is that has become a shrinking part of the time that's spent on air that's not advertising, and that is a real problem, and I do think that news channels and media companies have a responsibility to tell people what they need to know, not just what they need to hear. The problem is, obviously, these companies have been bought by much larger companies. Often, those companies feel like they're beholden to shareholders. They need to maximize profit. So that becomes an issue. Again, that having been said, I wouldn't just watch Fox News or CNN or MSNBC to get most of my information. For that matter, I wouldn't just read the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal to get my information. Part of what we need to do as savvy consumers of information is vary the sources of information we encounter. And I just want to end on one point. There is a lot of talk, and it's a very, very popular talking point I see it among my friends on social media, this idea that corporate ownership dictates editorial policy. When I say editorial policy, I say news policy. And people often point to Rupert Murdoch and News Corp and as a prime example of Rupert Murdoch pushing a conservative agenda. Now, his properties that he owned, their opinion pages and their opinion pieces are often conservative. Now, that was true of, say, the Wall Street Journal before Rupert Murdoch ever owned it. But the news side, the idea that Rupert Murdoch is calling up the Wall Street Journal editors and telling them, listen, I want you to write this news story in a way that's more favorable to my interests, is completely false. I'm just gonna say that. And there's a great example. Some of you may have heard of this company called Theranos. There's a pretty good HBO documentary if you happen to get HBO. Theranos was a company that specialized, a startup Silicon Valley company that raised a lot of money, said that it was revolutionizing the way we do blood testing. It raised hundreds of millions of dollars, about $800 million, and it was a sort of a unicorn, a Wall Street darling. Turns out it was a complete fraud. Rupert Murdoch was one of their largest investors. The Wall Street Journal exposed Theranos as a fraud. Rupert Murdoch lost $200 million when Theranos went out of business. If Rupert Murdoch could influence the reporting of the Wall Street Journal, I would imagine he would have said, listen, journalistic ethics are great, you're not gonna cost me $200 million. That's one example. I think it's a good example because the amount of money there is so large. But this idea that Jeff Bezos is calling up Marty Baron and telling him, listen, when you report on Amazon, use the kid gloves, do this. It doesn't happen usually. It happens incredibly rarely with standards-based news organizations. And when it does happen, as a reporter and editor, the first thing I do is I start talking about it. Because I don't want my boss telling me what to write or how to write based on what they happen to like. Now, that's good. That can be different on the opinion pages. But on terms of the news pages, I've been doing this for 20 years. It's never happened to me. I've got lots of friends who work at places like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Never happened to anybody I've heard. It has happened. It's not that it never happens, and there have been examples, but we tend to hear about it because reporters are ornery people. We don't like being told what to do, especially when what we're being told to do contradicts what we think our values are. Now, to answer very briefly your another point you raised, implicit bias and bias is something that journalists struggle with. We all have our biases. You don't, become a reporter and all of a sudden they, wave a magic wand and you lose all your bias. The same way that if you become a priest, you don't all of a sudden lose your bias. But you have a set of principles. You try to detect when bias is coming in. News organizations have editors and senior editors to try to detect those biases, but they exist. You want to be aware of them as a reporter, and you want to try to avoid those biases seeping into your work. I'll give you an example from my own work. I'm an atheist. I've done a fair amount of religion reporting. I did a long-term project about the spread of Pentecostalism in Europe. For me, my atheism, I knew that was a bias. This is my personally held belief. I'm reporting about religion. My personal bias should not play a role in the story that I'm trying to tell. And I think I did a good job. The people who were quoted in my article thought I did a good job. But what was really interesting to me is that I have a friend of mine who's also an atheist, read my article and said, when did you become someone who believes in religion? And I said, I don't. He says, well, then why are you writing this and writing in this way that makes these people look like good people? I'm saying, listen, my role as a journalist is not to spread my atheism. My role in my journalism is to report accurately and hopefully fairly. Not necessarily objectively, but fairly. And to treat the people that I report on fairly. And I've got lots of other biases and deeply held beliefs. I try to keep those in check, especially when I'm reporting on something that may conflict or may come up against something I'm reporting on.
We have time for a few more questions. I see one down here.
I'm concerned with when I go onto Google and I search something on Google. What are some steps that I can take to verify the sources that come up?
Right. So the first thing to know about Google and any search engine, as well as social media platforms, is they're all run by algorithms. Who here knows what an algorithm is? Raise your hand. Who here doesn't know what an algorithm is? Raise your hand. Who here is confused by the question? So an algorithm is a set of calculations in code which gets you to a result, right? Google is not a neutral arbiter of information. It's giving you information based on what you input, but also sometimes based on where you're located in the world, what your search history and what your preferences are, because it's trying to give you information which is what they think is more relevant to what you want to find, which is a laudable goal. But it also limits the information. So the first thing to realize is you're not getting all the information in the order that you might want it in. But more specifically to your question is you need to look at, Google itself is not a source of information, right? It's an aggregator. So it's trolling the internet and trying to find the information that it thinks is most relevant to what you're looking for. When you actually find a source, who is this source? How do they know what they claim to know? Are they proving what they know? I can say it's 73 degrees outside. How do I know that? What evidence am I proving? Can I investigate the evidence? Do I have another motivation to provide you that evidence? You know what? It's not 73 degrees, I'm sorry. It's actually 33 degrees, and by the way, I've got these great coats for sale. They're on discount. Do I have a motivation for giving you misleading information because I want to sell you a coat or an umbrella or a vacation to somewhere sunny? These are the questions you need to begin to ask of all the information, not just information you come on Google. You might come across somebody on Twitter who says, I know that the president is corrupt. How do you know that? What evidence are you providing? Can I look at the evidence you're citing and come to the same conclusion? All of that requires a deeper level of engagement with information. We can no longer just see a piece of information, see a tweet, and say, yep, or nah. We actually have to click on the link. We have to read the article. We have to assess the sources of information and the claims they're making. That takes more time, that takes more energy, that takes more engagement, but it's the only way you're actually going to know whether or not something is true or false or rooted in reality or just somebody's crazy conspiracy theory. And that's the reality I want to live in, is one that's based on fact-based information that I can independently assess and verify. I don't have to trust somebody to analyze, interpret, and verify the information for me, because what if they get it wrong? What if they have a motivation that they're not being upfront about? What if they're lying to me, but I'm trusting them to be the one who's making that value judgment on my behalf? And by the way, the same thing, these same processes apply to the New York Times, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal. You should be looking at that information skeptically as well. Again, not cynically, but when a reporter claims that they know something or a source has told them, but they're not telling you what the source is, then you have to take a step back. Like, okay, well, they're making a value judgment that this person is reliable, but can I do that? And that's going to be based on their track record as a reporter, the institutional safeguard, but also anonymous information by definition is less reliable because there isn't direct accountability. So me as a consumer of information, that may be true, but okay, what other supporting information do they have? Oh, it's all anonymous sources? maybe I'm not going to believe that as readily as something where people are on the record. There are documents that I can look at myself. I can look at that transcript of that phone call or that grand jury testimony and make my own assessment. Right now, to use the impeachment inquiry as an example, all of this information is closed door. So what we're seeing is selectively disclosed information, usually by politicians or their staff who have an agenda. That information may turn out to be accurate. Are we getting all of the testimony? Are we getting all of the context? No, not yet. So it's important to understand and look at, okay, we're getting some documents, we're getting some testimony, we're not getting everything. We have a window, we have a picture of what's happening, but one that is selective. So I, as a consumer of information, as a potential voter, still need to reserve judgment until more information comes out, more information that hopefully I can independently assess. That's my responsibility, and yeah, it's a lot more work like that, but that's the reality we live in.
Do we have time? One more question.
One more question, I guess.
This gentleman's had his hand up for half an hour.
And I'm happy to stay afterwards and chat with people.
So will be with us after as well.
So my question being, just two things. Number one, in the beginning when you had stated about fake news, you said that we should retire the term.
Yep.
And this is, I do have a second question, but the first question
Sure.
is, why do you think we should retire the word fake news? Again, I just want to recap on that. And
Yep.
then
We should retire the term fake news because it's inaccurate. Largely, most of the time when people are using the term, they're not using it to describe what it was originally meant to describe, which is misinformation masquerading as legitimate news. And the term has become highly politicized. It's become a derogatory term that people, politicians often, are using to describe news and information which they just don't like. It's oftentimes accurate, but unflattering. So if I'm a politician and I just did something corrupt and someone writes a news report, I'm gonna say, listen, that's fake news. That's not real, because I don't want you to believe the thing that's actually real. It's a very old tactic in terms of deflection and confusion with a new term. So I think that if we wanna talk about misinformation and disinformation, let's use very specific terms that talk about that. But this term fake news has become weaponized, and it's become oftentimes used by pundits and politicians against legitimate news and information it's created for the purpose of informing us.
So would you consider during the 2016 primary for the presidential race, when we kept hearing about Russia hacking our ballots, then can we consider that fake news even though Hillary lost? Because I'm falling a little confused, because when we were hearing about Russia hacking in and our president denying it, well, would you say the 1.8...
Which president are you
President Trump denied that,
Okay.
but wouldn't you say the people on the Democratic side, because I said it was, I didn't say it was fake news, I think it's real, but don't you think the people who actually won the primary would say that's fake news and they're the people that won?
I'm having a little
So what I'm trying to say is,
hard time understanding.
so when you had said fake news should be retired because it's like a derogatory term, what I'm trying to say is during the 2016 primary,
General election.
the general, well,
Right.
during, well, the presidential election,
Right.
when President Trump got voted into office, wouldn't we all say that the Republicans thought that it was fake news that Russia hacked into the voting? So why retire the term when it's not used as a derogatory term and the person who actually won the election said it themselves?
Okay, so there are a couple things to unpack. I'll try to do it relatively briefly. Multiple government agencies, and not just our government, have concluded that there was a concerted effort by the Russian government to interfere with the American 2016 election, both through the use of disinformation and other active measures. Whether or not you believe that or other people believe that is, is up to them. There's a lot of information about it out there, and you can come to your own conclusion, but that is the conclusion that many credible sources have come to. At the time of the election, the scope and scale wasn't fully understood by anybody, whether they be politicians, member of the government, member of the press, or technology companies. Since then, we know a lot more about the scope and the scale, and enough for me to say pretty definitively that with all the information we have out there, you can come to the conclusion that there was this active campaign. From what I have read and the statements that I've heard by the president, and I obviously do not speak for the president, my understanding is that many in the Republican circles and in the president's circle and the president, given his public statements, feel that there is an attempt to delegitimize his election by saying there was Russian interference. And part of that approach is to say that the corroborated, reported, both by our own intelligence agencies, the FBI, news organizations on all sides of the spectrum who are standards-based, say that there was this effort. So calling those reports fake news is a way to delegitimize those reports, with the idea that those reports then draw into question. If there was interference in the election, then some people might come to the conclusion that the president wasn't fairly elected. The president was elected. He is the president. Whether or not there's Russian interference is a separate question. So for me, that's a prime example of exactly why we need to retire the term fake news. It's being used in this particular instance to attack information which is well reported, legitimately reported, and has not been contradicted. It's just the people who are using the term don't like what the information is, and the information is potentially harmful to them and their interests. So they say, listen, that's not real, that's fake, don't believe it. Regardless of how much evidence they produce, it's fake. That's exactly why the term fake news is dangerous, because what it says is don't believe your eyes, don't believe what you can read, don't believe your own analysis, believe what I'm telling you to believe, and I'm not gonna provide you any evidence, I'm just gonna tell you to trust me. I'm a journalist. I don't trust anybody who tells me to trust them. There's an old saying in journalism, if your mother tells you she loves you, get a second source. Make sure that it's accurate.
That's good.
And I'll wrap up with a really brief example. When you were 4 or 5 years old, raise your hands if you believed in Santa Claus. Keep your hands up if you still believe in Santa Claus. Because there's a spoiler alert here, spoiler alert, Santa Claus is not real. Now, I know, right? It's mind-blowing. But here's the thing. Who told you that Santa Claus was real? Your parents, your teachers, your older siblings, all these authority figures, all these people you trusted implicitly were telling you a lie. Obviously, it's a white lie. It doesn't have huge consequences, but it illustrates, hopefully in a funny way, this idea that trust needs to be earned, right? Someone who says, trust me, okay, maybe you've said everything accurate, you've never lied to me in the past, but in the 21st century, it's still my responsibility to try to understand the information that I'm coming across and whether or not I can make that value judgment. Someone says, listen, this news report is inaccurate in the following ways. Let's go. Here are the 25 reasons why this is wrong, they got this wrong, this source doesn't exist. Okay, let me find out. Can I find out, is this a real person? Yeah. Did this person actually say those things? That's a lot more work. That's the kind of work that used to be just for journalists and researchers. And listen, you guys don't have to do huge deep dives on every single piece of information you come across on your daily basis. You probably do nothing but do that. That having been said, you do have a responsibility to question the information you come across. Who's saying it? Why are they saying it? Are they in a position to know? If you ask those 3 questions, usually within 30 seconds, you can get some level of answer. And if you can't get satisfactory answers, listen, don't share the information. Don't believe it. Maybe bookmark it, put it aside when you have more time to figure it out. But we do have a responsibility as good citizens not to share things which are lies.
Excellent, yeah.
Because it creates a dystopia of information. It creates a situation where all of a sudden nothing becomes real.
Yeah.
And that's what the people who are trying to manipulate us and manipulate our democracy, they want. They want you to believe that facts are negotiable. If I say that it's 73 degrees outside, you can get your own thermometer and measure that. You can fact check me if you want to. If I say it's hot outside, that's my interpretation, right? We can disagree on that. But to have a society, to have a working civic society, we need to be able to agree on facts, and then we can have a discussion about what those facts mean or how we interpret them. But right now, there is a war on facts. And that is really, really dangerous, because if we look at autocratic regimes throughout history, the first thing that governments do, and right-wing governments, left-wing governments, they say, listen, the only facts that exist are the facts that we tell you. And we're going to tell you the facts that are good for you. Well, as a citizen, I need to be able to make those judgments for myself, and that's the bedrock of a free and participatory democracy.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Damaso. Thank you.